Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of the Agronomists. I am your host, Lindsay Smith, and after 1 week away, I had forgotten how incredibly loud our intro music can be. Anyway, now that I've got ringing in my ears, let's get on with the show. All right, tonight we're talking fall fertility and fertility planning for next year. We've got a representative from the east, a representative from the west, very different conditions, very different things to think about and decide on. And so we'll be covering all of that. And I encourage everyone who's watching, get your questions in early, ask lots, ask follow-up questions. That's what makes this so great to be live, is having these guests here and getting to ask all your questions. I will, of course, remind everyone for participating in this program, you are qualified for CEU credits if those are things you collect. So head on over tomorrow to realagriculture.com/agronomists to get us your info, let us know you watched, and we'll get you your CEU credits. All right. Whew. Without further ado, on this very humid, very hot day here in Ontario, I'm going to bring in Mike Hilhorst with Federated Co-op near Wetaskiwin, Alberta, and Jake Munroe, our soil nutrient specialist with OMAFRA here in Ontario. Welcome, Mike. Welcome, Jake.
Good evening.
Thanks for having me.
Alrighty, so now, Mike, I'm going to start with you. Although Jake's new, this is the first episode of The Agronomist, so we're going to do a little intro in just a bit. But Mike, let me know, it's been a few weeks since we've had you on the show. How does the crop look where you are?
Well, that's a loaded question for sure. I mean, right in my area right here, central Alberta, along the QE2 corridor, it's actually not bad. It's probably some of the best crops I've seen across the West. I had the opportunity to drive to Saskatchewan and Manitoba a couple of weeks ago and look at some of the crops out there. And unfortunately, it's not great overall, but like I said, around here is okay. But, you know, even going an hour east of here and even into the Peace Country, I was there last week, and it's not looking great. I'll put it mildly. So.
Mm-hmm. There certainly seems to be pockets of not bad, and then giant areas of just really sad. So one quick note, I will say, Kara Oosterhuis, one of my colleagues here, she did put together a quick list of tips and things to remember when you're harvesting to be prepared for fire, potentially, and some prevention tips there. Definitely, everybody go check that out, especially, you know, on those long days when you're really busy. Sometimes it's easy to forget, but super important because it is so hot and so dry. All right, and Jake Munroe, welcome to the Agronomists.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I've enjoyed checking out this program over the last, few months, and yeah, it's great to be on.
Yeah, now, of course, for anyone who's been watching the Ontario Diagnostic Days, they know that you've been busy out in the field as well. So tell us where you're based and how the crops are looking in your area.
Yeah, so Lindsay, I'm normally based out of our Woodstock office, but I actually live in Guelph, and I've kind of this year got plots in kind of Wellington County, kind of north of Guelph, and then down into the kind of Haldimand and Niagara, as well as Brant County areas. And yeah, I mean, on some of those heavy clay soils, the comments from a couple growers down there, and certainly what I've seen is, at least for the corn crop, it's really one of the best crops they've had in a long, long time. Being able to have gotten out there, it's planted in a timely fashion with the dry conditions that we had early on, and it seems that corn's just kept chugging along, even though, you know, some areas certainly have gotten a lot of rainfall. It's looking pretty good. Soybeans in some parts where I've been traveling, certainly they did go backwards when we got a lot of that rain, and some quite, at least from the road, kind of haven't quite recovered yet. But all in all, I'd say in my travels, the crops are in pretty good shape as we head into this last stretch here in August.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Definitely seeing some pictures of, compacted or low areas with some root rot issues in soybeans, some white mold definitely showing up for sure. But the corn seems to be very happy with all this heat, and it makes me hate it just a little bit. Anyway, I don't love heat. So there you go. I would be a cereal like a spring wheat. Anyway, okay, so on to though our topic, of course. So we have sort of the tale of two different, very different sides here. We've got Ontario that's had, yes, we started dry, but Ontario has had ample moisture since. So we will, of course, have to tackle what we're going to be doing for our winter wheat crops going in here shortly, and how we plan for next year. But Mike, I want to start with you. We've certainly been seeing some excessively dry situations out west, to the point where we have questions about how do we even soil sample properly in excessively dry conditions. So how do you handle that question?
Yeah, it's not an easy one, that's for sure. I mean, it's so dry that in some cases you can. I think someone on Twitter today stuck a tape measure down a hole, and I've been walking a lot of fields over the last few days, and yeah, you could roll an ankle almost in some of the cracks in the ground. It's pretty pitiful. But, I think at the end of the day, we still have to, do what we can. Obviously, we hope there's going to be some moisture. We're ultra early right now. So, there's some crops being combined probably a month or so ahead. So obviously the hope is that we, in September into October, that we do get some moisture. But sampling will be difficult. There's no question. Even just getting a good core, in your soil sample probe these days is going to be very tough. So I think it's no real easy answers. I think we just have to wait and see, and see how things develop over the next month or so. But I don't think there's any question in most areas there's going to be some residual fertility left over in the fields. So this year, more than ever, I think we really need to be soil testing and making sure what we have in the in the soil going forward, because there's no question with some of the extremely poor yields that we're going to likely see and already have been reported that we're going to have some excess. So we need to be soil testing, I think, every year, but especially in years like this, just to see what we have going into next year, so we're not over applying in 2022. So.
Yeah, Jay, do you want to bring up? So my producer Jay's online. Jay, we've got I think Brunel Sabrin shared some pictures of some ridiculous cracking happening, and so he's south of Winnipeg in the Red River Valley, and don't drop your phone. So that's unbelievable. And as you said, Mike, though, of course, we are early in the season, but it does sort of feel like harvest in a lot of areas is rocking along ahead of schedule, which means we'll be heading into possibly wrapping it up early, which would give us a nice big open window to get all of that testing done. And this year, as you said, probably more important than most to get out there and get those samples done.
Yeah, I think another thing that we need to consider too is what you're actually going to use physically to soil test. Obviously, the ground's hard. It's going to be tight. It's going to be tough sampling. So in most cases, good luck with a hand probe. Certainly the in-cab units and whatnot are going to be probably what you're going to need to just physically get in there. But, we'll see what happens. Like we say, if we get some moisture, it might mellow things out a bit and enable us to, have some successful hand sampling if that's how you choose to do it. So.
And hello to Ray in the comments, of course, and Jason Vogt has already rolled an ankle in some of the cracks in Manitoba. So sorry about that, Jason. Get some ice on that. All right. Right. Okay. So I do want to, of course, I have a habit of not getting to the clips. And so, Jake, we're going to head over to your neck of the woods. We're going to head over to Ontario, but we're also going to head back in time to 2013 with wheat peat, and we're going to talk about, because of course the winter wheat crop here in Ontario for the most part is off. There's still, of course, some out there that's getting rained on, but as we prepare to head into this harvest season, we do need to be planning for this crop. So Jay, if we can roll that clip.
Yeah, so right now we're talking about seeding time. So let's forget about split apps and all that kind of stuff, and let's just focus on get the crop in the ground this fall with the highest possible yield potential. So we can talk about nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, and maybe sulfur, because sulfur is a big issue in many areas, including Western Canada. Ontario now, sulfur is an issue. And then all the micros, so the magnesiums and the manganeses and all those. Let's start there. First off, all those micros, it's all a bunch of bull. The only one that makes any difference, at least in Ontario conditions, is manganese, and it's really tough to correct it in the soil. So putting some micros with your liquid fertilizer, trying to do it that way, you're spinning your wheels. It really rarely is good money invested. You're better off to do it next spring. Let's talk next about nitrogen, because every year I get this question, what about some fall nitrogen to stimulate that growth? Well, the agronomists that ask or recommend that drive me nuts because they have zero data. We've done the trials, we have the data. In Ontario conditions, we simply lose half of that nitrogen, and we've never been able to increase our yields by adding nitrogen in the fall. So why not save the money and spend it on something that will increase my yield? So I'm out on fall nitrogen. Next, I want to talk about potash, because that's another really interesting one. And I always figured, potash is important. Well, it is on wheat, but not in the fall and not as a starter fertilizer. So if you have a really low soil test, you want to add a wee little bit of potash, that's okay. Maintaining your soil potash level at good levels is incredibly important. Don't argue about that. But if you don't use any potash in the fall, you know what? It won't hurt you one bit. So I've sort of thrown out nitrogen, I've thrown out potash, I've thrown out all the micros. What does that leave? Leaves phosphorus, and that's where it's all about. It's all about phosphorus. And so you need to put phosphorus on, and it's best put right with the seed. So I want to see at least 50 pounds of MAP. I like 100 pounds better. 100 pounds of MAP is 50 pounds of phosphorus. You can do that with liquid as well. I had an excellent discussion with a top wheat grower in Lambton County 2 nights ago, Wednesday night, and he clearly said that in his conditions, he's done the trials, 9 gallons of liquid starter fertilizer gives him more yield than 5 gallons of liquid starter fertilizer. So you can do it with liquid. It just takes a lot of dollars to do it because liquid is a little bit more expensive. I like dry better from that standpoint. And I like seed placed. Why do I like seed placed? Well, let's have a look at that. So I come out into this field and I broadcast my fertilizer. And I get a granule here and a granule here and a granule here and here and here. And even if I work them in, then I take my wheat and I plant that in a row and I put my seed down there, that 1 inch deep. Well, where's my fertilizer? Yeah, well, it's spread all over the place, and what are the chances that that wheat seed and that root coming out of the wheat seed is going to intercept a granule of that phosphorus? Because that's what it needs to do to get good utilization. The chance is not very good. If I put that same fertilizer right there with the seed, what's the chance my seed will find it and be able to utilize it? And the answer is way better. So in our research data, seed-placed fertilizer is 4 times more efficient than broadcast fertilizer. The other thing about broadcast fertilizer is if I put it on the soil surface in a no-till situation, which is the way we plant most of our wheat, and it works really, really well, well, fall phosphorus on the soil surface, and then we get a thunderstorm or a heavy rainstorm. Where does that phosphorus go? Well, it's soluble, or it wouldn't actually work for the plant. That means there's a decent chance it ends up in the water and it moves into the water course. It's bad for the environment, and it also doesn't help me make any money. So from both of those perspectives, really want to see you put that stuff in furrow and make the most out of that phosphorus fertilizer. Really intriguing. It's a 7 bushel yield increase if you put that stuff in furrow. I can't make you that with any other fall fertilizer. All about phosphorus, and make sure you do it.
And make sure you do it. All right. So, all right, Jake, I'll go to you. So it is a video from 2013, which for some of us feels like maybe only a year or 2 ago, but apparently it was quite some time ago. So do you think we've moved the needle on getting that phosphorus down with the seed with the winter wheat crop?
Well, I think that message has been put out now, thanks to Peter and others and Dr. Dave Hooker, as well as Joanna Fallings at Almafra. I think that message has gotten through to most growers, and it's good that it has, right? Because I do see it on more growers' radar, or the awareness I think is relatively high on that. And not a lot is simple with agronomy, but I think Peter kind of demonstrated there. This is a pretty simple one, and this, you see it time and again just how important that phosphorus is. Especially, I guess the one got a bit of subtlety that I'll add to it is it depends a little bit on what your soil test is. But unless you're like, say, a chicken farmer or a hog farmer who's got really high soil tests, generally you're going to benefit from putting phosphorus with that seed.
There has to at least be some it depends. So good for you for getting this. There's always some of that in there. But I am glad to, and that was a couple of years ago, but certainly that discussion of, and I know we've had Deg Campbell on this show as well, of broadcasting phosphorus is still pretty common in the fall here in Ontario. But that does, and we do have a clip later on that does potentially set us up for the risk of higher losses. So again, as you said, I mean, nothing is super simple with agronomy, but this is one of those ones that in furrow, get some of that phosphorus down with that seed. Yeah, and it really is a win-win. Yeah, I know, Lindsay, we're gonna talk about that issue and the environmental side that Peter alluded to. But yeah, there's no better thing you could do in terms of water quality and keeping nutrients on your farm than subsurface placement. So yeah, it checks all the boxes. Okay, so now we did have a couple questions that did come in just before we headed to this clip. So Mike, I want to come back to you, and it's further out there, but the question was about, if we're getting, let's say, some rain now, because in some areas, there has been some rain this week. In some areas of the prairies, they've been very dry. Now, obviously, for most of this crop, it's too late, right? I mean, yields are what they're going to be. That rain's not going to do a ton for herbicide breakdown, for yield, and not a lot for the soil necessarily. So how do we sort of account for, say, later season moisture when it comes to the fertility question?
Well, there again, I think, we have to be soil testing and assess that. At the end of the day, that's really gonna to tell us what's going on and what's happened in the last month or so. If we do get some rain, there might be some late season mineralization. It's still quite warm out, so we might see some of that enter the crop system. And I think obviously we need to make sure, even in the poor crops, that we're keeping the weeds under control, because they may surprise you when it comes to a soil test after a poor crop year with a lot of weeds growing. Some producers ask, well, why is my soil test of nitrogen so low? Well, there was a pile of wild oats there or something that got through, which we are seeing here in certain areas for different reasons other than the drought. But anyway, I think there again, it just goes to the soil test. We can guess and do whatever we want based on past history and whatnot. But I still think, especially in years like this, soil testing is still key. Certainly to the 0 to 6, and I even like to see it down to 24 inches to assess any fertility movement, some deep-seated salinity and things like that we can see in certain areas, especially when we're talking about zone management and some of the limitations that causes for certain crops too. So I still think the soil test is going to be so important.
Well, and realistically, for many farmers, this is going to be a tight year on income. Disastrous in some instances. Every dollar we don't have to spend for next year's crop that's okay. So if the fertility's there, then it's good to know it's there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as far as the soil testing cost, it's probably less than 0.5% of your actual input costs, and we're talking about well over $100 an acre. And in most crops that we're putting into the ground, we need to know where that fuel gauge is at, or else we're just guessing, and then we can run into problems like bad lodging and things like that in years where we do get ample moisture or decent moisture. So.
Absolutely. All right. So Jason wants to know, and so this is now Jason's based in Manitoba, but it relates to our last video here, Jake, on fall seeded crops in southern Manitoba. Fall conditions, let's say they stay really dry. Do you still apply phosphorus with the seed at the rates Peter was talking about because of potential toxicity, or what's the risk management there? So in dry conditions, would you pull back the phosphorus rate?
So and not knowing exactly in terms of what the recommendations would be in a soil test, and so I'll just to kind of give a general answer. I think we don't have at those kinds of rates. we don't have large concerns about, we're typically talking monoammonium phosphate or MAP as the phosphorus source. We don't have large crop safety concerns at those kind of rates. And we are talking, of course, Ontario and moist soil conditions, that we typically would have that time of year and then going into the winter. Generally speaking, if your soil test is calling for it, I would still go with pretty decent rate. I don't know if Mike, you maybe have more experience in those kind of drier soils, or if you would have any concern there.
Yeah, I think it depends on the crop, but obviously cereals have a pretty darn good tolerance compared to pulses and canola and things like that. And since we're talking about winter wheat, you're probably going to be okay, especially if you do get some rain to, obviously to germinate the winter crop and get it into that, 3 or 4 leaf stage that we like to see. So yeah, I mean, the risk is likely fairly minimal, but like you said, Jake, it really depends on the rate. Are we talking about 50 pounds actual versus 25 or 30, which is actually fairly common out here? Like you say, it really depends on soil test, past practices and things like that. But
all right, now Mike, you did bring up sort of grid sampling zones, of course all these different ways we manage our fields now, right? So we've got management zones. Some people do benchmark sampling, some do zone sampling, grid, that sort of stuff. So when this fall, especially when you're going to sit down with growers and try and develop a plan, how are you going to approach this with farmers?
Yeah, well, I guess every farm's different, so it's kind of a loaded question. But there are farms that do very little sampling, or they do, say once every 3 years. There's the guys and gals that composite sample every year, which is great. And there's farms that have taken it to that, that ultimate level of zone sampling based on maybe 2 or 3 different levels or map layers to determine those soil zones. So everybody's going to have a little bit of a different plan, but I think certainly the ones that don't soil test a lot want to get them to that yearly composite at least. And then the ones that are generally involved in a pretty solid variable rate program are pretty dedicated to that, and they're going to, usually they're testing every zone every year, but not necessarily, depending on the nutrient as well. So they might change the the test that they're looking for potentially and things like that. But yeah, I think, like I said, no matter what you're doing, I think you at least need to do it. Soil sampling, that is. And, if you're a composite or a VR sampler, I mean, there's obviously some tweaks that go along with that along the way, but it's still going to be very important. But the discussion can be quite different depending on the farm that you're dealing with. So
now, Jake, in Ontario, of course, we'd love to see a 3 crop rotation. It happens a lot, not everywhere. Sometimes there's maybe even some cover crops in there, or maybe hay. It's amazing. Anyway, but for your typical Ontario 3 crop rotation that we hope everyone is using, do you still recommend soil testing every year, or do you work with farmers and try and fit it in ahead of particular crops more than others?
Yeah, so in like you say, it's not every acre for sure that's in corn, soybeans, and wheat for cash crop acres, but in situations where it is, we'd recommend sampling once every 3 years in that wheat phase, ideally. So you're generally going to have a bit more time in this window of time that we're in right now to get out there and get your soil sampling done, or have someone do it for you. And so, yeah, in an ideal world, you've got 3 crops in rotation. I know you guys talked about resiliency, and I'll just plug, wheat's so important for building up soils and soil health. So that's a great time to do it. If you're in a corn soybean rotation, that's going to partly depend, I think, on what kind of range you're in for your soil test. So if you're really kind of depleted, or on the low end farm, you got a farm that say for phosphorus on the Olsen test is in maybe even single digits, which certainly we have farms like that. You really might want to be out there doing every 2 years. It's maybe a little bit excessive, but again, if you're fertilizing that crop in season, you need to know where you're at. If you, however, again, I kind of pointed to the high fertility examples. You've got maybe history of plenty of manure, and that your soil tests are high. You probably don't need the same level of fertility going in year out if you're at that high level. And 2, you probably don't need to be in there every 2 years. You know, if it's corn soybean rotation, every 4 years, to kind of monitor things. At least that's my view.
But please put in wheat anyway. And
Absolutely.
then someone of course has already said they don't grow poverty grass anymore. So we're already out, Jake. That's it. Okay, but Gord is asking, for a cover crop after wheat, do you feed it or do you let it scavenge for nutrients?
Yeah,
what do you think, Jake?
I like that question. I think it depends a little bit on what your system is. So if you're a large stock farmer with manure, then maybe the answer is obvious. You know, you're getting that manure out there anyway, and you're going to be feeding it. If you're a cash cropper, like a few that I've got in mind who are cover croppers, in most cases, most growers, at least that I know, aren't feeding it in terms of fertilizer. But they are looking at if they're in a location where there's, say, processed biosolids or municipal compost or anything like that, organic amendments, especially organic amendments that have a nutrient profile that kind of matches their needs, then it's a great opportunity. So I guess the answer I would say is definitely feed it if you can, if it's at all feasible, with manure or organic amendments. When it comes to fertilizer, if that's your only option, and if you've found in the past that you're just not getting the growth, maybe you're on a heavier clay soil, or you're on you just don't get the kind of cover crop growth that you might expect or want. I don't think there's anything wrong with maybe 30 pounds of actual nitrogen if you've got a cover crop like oats and radish that's going to be able to really take that up, take it into the plant tissue, turn it into an organic form, and certainly make very good use of that. So I think we maybe need to look even more at finding ways to feed cover crops. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think Pete mentioned, as we're talking about trying to potentially make as much hay as possible that might be transported potentially out west. There was the discussion of if you're putting in a cover crop to try and take a cut of hay, then you might want to throw some N at it to make sure it gets up and going and gets that early growth right away so that you actually do. But if it's just there to keep the ground covered, keep the living roots and scavenge, then maybe that's okay.
Yeah, for sure. And that's an excellent point. And also, it depends on how much money you want to be spending again. And it's another pass over the field too, to just put a bit of nitrogen. I'm not convinced, but certainly you see the cover crop respond. So if you're growing it for a forage, for sure.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I'm cheap and a sheep farmer, so I don't have extra money. Okay. So, but Mike, we've got quite a few questions coming in on the West, which I figured would probably happen because, of course, we do have so many things to consider in such a dry year in so many areas. So, Mr. Tate, who I'd love to know your first name, Mr. Tate, does the lack of moisture mean our last year's residue is providing less nutrients? So this, even more broadly, how does this decreased moisture lead to that nutrient cycling in general?
Yeah, obviously there's going to be more of the applied fertilizer likely still left with these poor crops. But as far as mineralization goes, or what that straw is going to be providing back into the system, I don't think there's any question that mineralization rates are going to be down significantly. So I would say that there's definitely going to be less mineralization and less breakdown of even last year's straw to add to the nutrient profile in the fields this year. I don't think there's any question. You need moisture, to feed all these biological processes. We've certainly had the heat, maybe too much even, but you definitely need both. And I don't see a lot of breakdown. And obviously, just to add to that question too, we're likely going to have to be very careful about chemical residues into next year, depending on what we use this year. That could very much be an issue next season. And in some cases, in these extreme droughts, I've even seen it, last up to 2 years, depending on the crop we're talking about, if it's a lentil versus canola versus wheat, whatever it is. But that's a concern of mine as well.
Yeah, I've certainly heard that, we know that in-season moisture is what drives that breakdown of those herbicides, right? So for some that are in their second or third dry year, they could be looking at recropping restrictions even next year from 2 years ago, which is
Yeah.
a lot to think about. So if you're at all worried, send in your soil.
Yeah.
All right, so Jeneth has a really good question. So Jeneth farms northeast of Winnipeg. This is an interesting question. When is best to soil sample grainland in a severely dry fall? So Jeneth, we're going to assume the rain does not begin at any time. So would now or end of August be fine? Or should you wait till October?
I think from my perspective, I would probably, I kind of like October over August, to be honest with you. It's a little cooler. Things in the soil have settled down, and I hope out your way, Jeneth, you get some rain, which will make sampling a lot easier by October, northeast of Winnipeg. But that would be my preference. But there has been a lot of studies done. There's always the debate about September, October soil sampling versus spring, and if there's a massive difference in your soil test levels. And I think there's been a lot of evidence that's suggested that no, that's not the case. The best time is to get out there whenever you can, obviously, and soil testing, versus not soil testing, obviously. But do it when you can. But as things, mid-September soil-wise, start to cool down and level off, I think any time from there till freeze up is a great time to get out there and soil test. Though the air temperatures may fluctuate a lot, the soil will not. So you're pretty safe, I think, in my opinion. That September, October, I like it right now.
All right, and frankly, if you've got time in August, Jeneth, go to the beach. Okay, so there's Manitoba has fantastic beaches. I'm just saying. Okay. Don't love Winnipeg, but Manitoba, thumbs up. Okay. All right. Of course, journey to the second clip. I'm going to go a little out of order here because I want to, along this discussion of soil testing and conditions and area, that sort of stuff, we're going to skip to Ben Rosser's clip here. This is, I think it's a corn school, testing for strip tillage. So when you're using strip till, should you be testing in the strip? Outside? Do you mix them? What do you do? So we're going to watch this clip, and then we're going to start talking about strategizing how we're testing these fields.
One of the big benefits of strip till is being able to put fertilizer in that strip when we're going, which is great, but obviously from a fertilizer soil testing perspective presents a bit of a challenge. So again, depends a bit on the system. Some strip tillers are moving their strip consistently, say 10 inches every year in that corn year to spread fertilizer applications across the field. But other guys like the approach of just always keeping the strip in the exact same spot. Keeps tire traffic off the corn rows. They like that benefit. But then of course you're constantly just building that strip every time you're doing a strip till pass in that rotation. So just as an example, for a grower who's keeping it in the exact same spot, Jake Munroe had done some soil sampling last summer, and in his case, when he looked at values inside of the strip where P and K had been built, he had a soil test P value of 58 in the strip and a soil test K value of 106 in the strip. When he compared soil sampling outside the strip, where they was never stripped and never banded with fertilizer from the strip tiller, it was a 21 for P and an 83 for K. So clearly building things over time in those strips.
So Ben, clearly we've got a higher concentration of fertilizer in that strip. So when you're soil testing, you want to get an average look at that field. How do you collect your samples?
Right, and obviously that's a challenge, right? Because our test has been calibrated for a field that's been broadcast. Corn roots aren't just confined in that zone. They're using the the whole soil profile and out in the rows as well to pick up nutrients. But obviously you want to capture what would it look like had there been fertilizer broadcast across the whole field to actually use the recommendations, right? In the Pub 811 or whatever you're using. Mm-hmm. So there was some work done actually in Illinois where they compared that. They compared strip till where fertilizer was banded in the strip, and they compared that to no-till where fertilizer had been broadcast across the field. And basically their goal was, how can you soil test in a strip till scenario to get the same ppm value in a soil test as where you would soil test across a no-till field where things have been broadcast. So they looked at a bunch of different scenarios. What they found is that if you take one soil test inside of that zone where fertility had been built, for every 2 or 3 samples taken outside of the strip, so in between your corn rows, on average, once you mix all those soil samples up, you would get a value that was pretty similar to where the same amount of fertilizer had been broadcast in the no-till plot right beside it. So that's, the general recommendation is 1 core in that built up strip for every 2 or 3 cores taken outside of that strip to get that field average.
what about a grower who wants to come back in on the same strip? Obviously they're more concerned about the fertility in the strip rather than the overall field.
Right. So, in a low testing field, sometimes the corn row syndrome, we call it, shows up in wheat, where you can see the old fertilizer bands. So growers who are coming back on the exact same strips every time they do strip, some approaches they're taking is making sure in general their field soil tests are in good shape to start with. I think that's key. And also, if you're putting down wheat and beans, I think a lot of the growers who are in that system are putting some fertility down with them as well, to make up for that too. So I think, obviously there's a system that has to work. Those are some of the things some of the things they're doing to make that system work, to come back and always build those same strips year after year.
Okay, so that is, Jake, that is an older clip. And Joey in the comments says that field has some emergence issues. Please don't judge the corn crop, okay? It did its best. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so this work though, and as Ben mentioned in that clip, of course, you had been doing some of the soil sampling and the nutrient work for some of these trials. Now, we've actually had a corn school very recently that was also looking at strip tillage and putting fertility down, and making the strips in the fall, putting the fertility down in the fall, making the strips in the spring and putting the fertility down in the spring, or at least some of it. So catch us up a bit on, because that is only a couple years old though, is that still the recommended practice of testing in row and out row and mixing them up?
Yeah, absolutely. That is still the recommended practice. That work was done in the Midwest a number of years ago, not too long ago. I mean, strip till still kind of relatively recent and gaining a lot of popularity, and so they did very comprehensive work looking at all different kinds of combinations of how many do you do in strip versus out of strip. And like Ben said, it's one in strip for 2 to 3 outside of the strip, and that really gives you a good kind of representation of the composite value of that soil, which again, if you're looking at any of the recommendations that we have here in Ontario, you need to have that basis to compare to, because that's what we've got, where the way that all the trials have been done historically. So that's still a recommendation. And Ben's been continuing to work with strip till and has some, we're still learning more, because you can think about, that scenario where that grower, and where we sampled was a grower who's doing exactly that, just has that strip in the exact same location. He's got RTK, so he's right on the same spot every 3 years when he comes to corn. And it's maybe something that we're going to need to look at more into the future as more growers adopt strip till. But, I would think there's a certain point at which you maybe need to adjust your fertility strategy after 10, 20, 25 years. We saw that phosphorus value was, at 50, 56 or 57 right in the strip for that grower. But I think for the time being, that's a completely reasonable approach. And like Ben said, finding ways to, with your other crops, to get some phosphorus in particular, but some potassium as well, kind of spread throughout that soil, that would be a benefit.
And so because as you mentioned, strip tillage is it's certainly catching on, but it is still a relatively new practice. And certainly there's farmers out west practicing it as well. There has been some work looking at, putting fertility down in the fall versus the spring, and suggesting that spring applied may have a slight edge. What about that? I mean, should farmers be freshening up strips in the spring and putting fertility down, or just doing it all in the spring? How does that work?
So I'm going to start with it depends again, because I think that work, and I know Ben, I know that's kind of some recent findings he's had, and he does a great job of getting out to having plots in numerous different locations. But it depends, I think, partly on what are you dealing with to start with. If your grower who's just adopted strip till, what kind of farms are you managing? Are they high fertility, medium, or low? And so I think, maybe more in those kind of low fertility sites, where, again, maybe single digit for phosphorus or just in the low teens for phosphorus soil test levels. I think that's where that spring fertility may shine going in the strip, because you may be getting a bit of a starter effect as opposed to putting it down in the fall. But I think there's other considerations that probably trump that or come before that, and that would be, what's the right system for you? Is it fall strip till or spring strip till based on time, labor, soil type, and those kind of considerations? And then, the refresh question. I know there's growers investigating it. I don't think we have the answers yet, but there may be situations, again, those low soil test soils where maybe it would pay to come in and refresh, largely for the sake of getting fertility down. But again, those are kind of research questions still to investigate.
I see that Peter Johnson has joined us, and he would like you to know, and everyone to know, that staying on the same strip is horrible for wheat. Please don't do it. I added the please because I feel he needs to add that as well. Okay, so now we do have a question from Peter, though, for you, Mike. When we're talking about nitrogen in the West, isn't later in the fall better for testing in N? So I guess this goes back to the August versus October. So if we're talking about N, later is better.
Yeah, I think for sure. Like, once the soil starts to cool down in August and September, I mean, your mineralization rates start to just about cease, especially as you get into later September and into October. So that's one of my favorite times to soil test, no question. From the end of September till, it depends. It can be into the end of November, depending on how cold it gets, and if the soil freezes up, obviously. Moisture conditions, all those kind of things play into it. But yeah, I don't think there's any question that's a great time. Though there again, it depends on the farm. We do have a lot of farms in different areas that fall banned nitrogen, usually after harvest. So that's usually in October. So, we have to, if we are going to soil test and make a recommendation for those farmers, we better be on the ball with the soil test trucks, chasing the combines off the field in order to get that right. So and sometimes that's maybe mid-September, but it varies by farm, like Jake said too, as far as your approach and how you're going to go about it.
One of my favorite things actually is when things are very, very frozen, is to watch those trucks go out. And it's very impressive to see that they can still get a soil sample when most of us would be hard pressed to even get anything in the ground. So anyway, okay. I do want to, this actually does segue into, because Mike, one of the things I do want to talk about is, of course, as you mentioned, fall banding, or just fall applied fertility in general, in excessively dry conditions, what we might need to consider. So that comes into also our discussion about phosphorus, because I think every fertility discussion, every fertilizer discussion, we need to talk about phosphorus and keeping it where we want it. So we will go to our last clip. This is with Maren McCrae. This is a soil school episode, and we're talking about managing phosphorus and trying to keep it where we need it.
A lot of your work focuses on phosphorus, and that's what I want to talk about today. It's a critical nutrient for crop production, but it does have its environmental challenges, and farmers and government have been working 5-10 years now to get a handle on things and make sure we're managing things better. Phosphorus, from your perspective, how are we doing today? Are we better, and in what ways?
I do think we're better. I think we've learned a lot. I think that there were some really innovative people long ago who were doing some of these right things, and we've been doing a lot of edge of field and on-farm research and working together as a community to understand what is working, what isn't working as well, and getting more of that information into the hands of those who need it. And I think more and more people are adopting BMPs, or best management practices, and I do think we're further ahead. I do think we have more work to do, but I think we are definitely doing a better job.
So let's talk about, I guess, some of those, the challenge, and two parts of this, right? There is phosphorus surface and how it leaves the field, and then subsurface. Talk about what we've learned, from runoff on the field versus through tiles.
Sure. So I think some of that is really where a lot of this work that certainly that my team has been doing over the last probably decade or so began, was to try to understand that tile drain story, and just what was the contribution or the relative contributions of surface runoff and subsurface runoff in terms of the phosphorus story. And so I think what we've learned is we have learned that phosphorus leaves the fields, both in the surface and in the subsurface. Now, we know that probably about 20% of runoff, or of the water leaving the fields, leaves on the surface, and a solid 80% of that water leaves in tile drains. So a lot of it really does travel in the subsurface, and that happens year round. Even if you can't see it, it's still flowing. But when we look at how much of the phosphorus is actually being delivered, we do find that it depends where you live. And so in places like Midwestern Ontario and some of the rolling topography, like the silt loam and clay loam soils, in those cases, surface runoff is really where a lot of the phosphorus is leaving the fields. Whereas once you get into the clay plain down around Essex and areas like that, tile drains start to play a much bigger role in the phosphorus story. And they probably are losing something like 80%, or probably about 80% of the phosphorus is leaving the fields through tiles in that region. So really the partitioning of that water between the two pathways does differ depending on where you live.
Now, Marion, you talked about tiles, and they come under a lot of scrutiny. And I'm just wondering, what can we do to manage our tiles better? What do we need to understand as farmers?
Well, I think the first place to begin is to realize that we have to manage things in the surface and in the subsurface, and we don't want to do something that is maybe going to control things at the surface, but be at the expense of losses in the subsurface in tile drainage. So I think it's important to remember that we need tiles because we need to be able to get on fields and drain fields in order to get a yield, but we know that there can be environmental consequences. And so I guess the first thing is there are certain conditions under which tiles have larger consequences. And so those conditions can sometimes relate to soil texture. So where you live, are you in the heavy clays or are you in the loamy soils, which seem to be able to buffer the phosphorus out a little bit more. Another feature that can really increase phosphorus loss in tile drains, is connectivity between phosphorus-rich surface soils and the tile drains through what we call preferential flow or macropores. So that can be wormholes, cracks, root channels, you name it. So there are certain conditions, like if you have really stratified high phosphorus soils at the surface, those are conditions where if you have a lot of connection between the surface and your tiles, that can rapidly enter tiles. So what we want to do is really disconnect that source from that pathway. And so some ways to do that would be simply to have lower soil P or manage the supply in your soil. So you can do that either by reducing your soil phosphorus or by applying it in the subsurface, like by banding. These are all sorts of things that we can do to reduce some of that, either reduce that stratification or just sort of disconnect that supply from those preferential flow paths into tile drains.
Oh goodness, as we were having that conversation, the comments have blown up, and some of these I'm going to get to, but I apologize in advance. We're not going to get to all of them. But really the point here, Jake, I'll go to you first, certainly. And if anybody watched our last episode of The Agronomists on soil resiliency, Anne Verhollen was here and talking about those great macropores that the giant earthworms make here in Ontario soils. And now Marin's telling us that if you have phosphorus-rich topsoil or in near the surface, it's going to run into your tiles and leave your farm. How do we win? Jake, how do we win?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lindsay. So I think Marin was starting to get at it and basically in saying that, like those earthworm burrows do a lot of good, right? First off, they help, when we get 8 inches in, a day of rain, those are the things that you need there to help transmit that water quickly. But, she's really talking about what you don't want to be doing is, surface applying phosphorus, particularly in the fall or close to freeze up or close, in say, November or something like that, where we're then going to get into, depending on the part of Ontario, you get into, multiple kind of freeze thaw events with water running off the surface, or even, maybe more northern parts of the province where we're going to get we're just going to freeze up and maybe have a big thaw event in the spring where that phosphorus is going to be right there and able to move right when most water is moving through the tile. But it's not black and white in terms of one is completely wrong and that you can't and shouldn't be developing those great earthworm burrows and connections down to lower in the soil. I think it comes down to just managing depending on kind of what your situation is and what kind of soils you're farming. She kind of alluded to the fact that in some parts of Ontario, kind of further up in the Lake Erie watershed, up toward the Dundalk Plains and throughout kind of Wellington, Waterloo counties, that surface runoff is really the major contributor to phosphorus. So in those situations, the more that we can reduce erosion, reduce particulate phosphorus moving, the better. And the more earthworm burrows, the better, because it's just going to help that water get down. But yeah, she did mention those heavy clays. Those are the ones we need to watch, and we don't want to stratify that phosphorus, just in the top, few centimeters, and just, looking at timing, how can we apply that phosphorus if we are surface applying at a lower risk time of year, like right now.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mike, I'll go to you because, of course, I grew up out west, and certainly many discussions about we don't typically get the same freeze-thaw cycles that Ontario gets, or big rain events late in the year, but certainly we get, in the area of Manitoba I'm from, major runoff events in the spring, so still at risk of particulate moving or some of that dissolved phosphorus potentially moving off as well. So how then are Western farmers, or at least in your area, tackling the phosphorus question?
Yeah, I think in most cases, most farmers are banding with the seed in the spring. I think for the most part, you will see some guys that will band, urea and MAP sometimes once in a while when they do a band. A lot of that's just logistical, so they can get enough fertilizer down, say with canolas and whatnot. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's always the best in the ground and likely in the spring just before the crop needs it. Depending obviously on your topography of your land that you're farming and things like that. If you have really rolling land with a lot of waterways running through it and a lot of adjacent sloughs and possibly even lakes, obviously you're going to potentially run into some problems with algal blooms and polluting the water and the rivers as well. So yeah, it's not something that we want to do. So we want to try to manage that on a farm by farm basis. And obviously some areas are at higher risk than others.
Mm-hmm. Peter Johnson says, with clay soil that's not tiled, will it lose less phosphorus or have more surface flow, so still have phosphorus loss or high phosphorus losses? That's an excellent question.
Yeah, I can give that a go a little bit. Like I just kind of generally speaking, tiles, at least again on kind of more of those landscapes that I was referring to in terms of more kind of the upper Lake Erie watershed, kind of more undulating, more where we're losing the phosphorus through erosion and water running off. That tile drainage actually helps to reduce that surface runoff drastically, and therefore, may even be a net positive in terms of the phosphorus, again, depending how the nutrients are managed. So just in terms of addressing Peter's question, yeah, on those flatter, heavy clay soils, if they weren't tiled, perhaps, and certainly can see quite significant erosion on some of our clay soils. I don't know the answer, but I think tiles, when managed well, and when our nutrients are managed well through subsurface placement, through preventing that stratification and that high concentration at the surface, can I think in some cases can be a positive. And of course, it's just a must on those soils that have inherently poor drainage and need to get that excess water out in the springtime.
Mm-hmm. Now, Rye Carlson has mentioned here the use of cover crops to keep phosphorus, and of course, cover crops can play a huge role in tying up nutrients, keeping them where we want them. But I think he's using all caps, so I think he's yelling. But I'm not going to shout. But essentially, having a cover crop there in the fall for sure will help keep soil where we want it, keep nutrients where we want it. But of course, we're also figuring out the whole cover crop question too, aren't we? Here in Ontario. So there's, for some And actually next week, this is a good plug for next week's show. We're going to talk red clover and other cover crop options and success with fall cover crops. So we'll do that as well. But Mike, we're running out of time here. Of course, this has been fantastic. I really appreciate this. Love all the questions that have come in. Really great discussions happening in the comments too. But I did want to talk about this, Mike, before we go. With dry conditions, assuming we're still in a dry bias, maybe not as bad a drought, let's hope. What challenges are farmers going to be facing in trying to get some of that fertility on this fall, as is typical? Or do you think more farmers are going to wait just because they don't want to disturb the soil if we're really dry?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of fields, maybe just going back to that phos question for a bit, one of the things that's helped us with soil erosion and phosphorus movement is obviously all the zero till that does happen out in Western Canada. That's been a big positive, obviously, as far as soil movement goes. But as far as this question goes, I think you're going to have to really take a serious look at what you usually do versus what you may or may not do this fall, because I'm quite concerned about just the physical application of the fertility, whether it's anhydrous ammonia or urea. If it is, say, urea, it better be stabilized. If you are going to use some do some banding this fall, I think you got to look at urease inhibitors and things like that to keep it where it is. But I am quite concerned about the very likely lack of good soil closure behind the shanks when we're doing our banding operations this fall with this dry, clumpy soil. I don't know. I'm afraid we're going to lose quite a bit depending on the area and the soil type, especially on those heavier clays. It's going to be clumpy. It's going to be lumpy. It's it's almost a very wet soil issue too. Sometimes is what you're going to look at. But as far as doing a good job, I guess is what I'm saying. And if that money's going to be spent, the way we really want it to be, I would question it pretty hard looking at things right now. So I think that's got to come into the conversation too. Obviously, a lot of the banding, is performed due to logistics for the next spring. Especially, I see a lot of cereal stubble get banded, so we can handle the amount of fertilizer going down with canola and not putting as much, with the seed and things like that. All those kind of considerations. But I don't know. We're going to have to take a serious look at it and really decipher if it's the best thing to do if these conditions continue into that mid-late fall. It's not going to be an easy decision, but I think it's one that has to be made, because we could easily lose 20, 30, 40% of our fertilizer in a few minutes after we drag the anhydrous cultivator across there or whatever it may be. So that's my biggest concern with right now with potentially applying nitrogen this fall, especially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jason Vogt, who's in, as I mentioned, southern Manitoba, said figures low disturbance fall single disc banding is what will happen if at all, and likely P, K, and S will go down, but N will wait for the spring. And of course, this does bring us back to, if you don't have a soil test, you don't know what's still there, and you may not necessarily need to be putting down a heck of a lot of fall fertility if it does remove more from the spring application with the crop. As you mentioned, yes, canola can be a bit of, it's a small seed. It gets hurt sometimes. You got to watch it in the spring.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And also we have learned that Tate is Mr. Tate's first name. So for everyone who was waiting for that, his first name is Tate. We just don't know his last name. All right. And Ray, this is a good comment. Economics will play a role for some growers that had contracts they need out of. So farm income will be a flag this fall. This is one of those things that absolutely we can't talk fertility management without the economics coming in 3 different ways. And I think we've talked about this as far as, you might be able to save some money by knowing what's there and not having to apply. But you do have to pay for the soil test. But you also want to make sure you're not going to short next year's crop. So this is, I think Ray is bang on. There's going to be a lot of tough decisions this fall, for sure. All right. Okay.
Yeah,
well,
that's a good point, Ray, because we really didn't.
Well, there's a delay. Go ahead, Mike.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this summer it's been a little bit unusual. We haven't really seen the reset reset, so to speak, in fertilizer prices. They remain fairly high, well, quite high actually throughout the season and into the fall here, from what we can see right now. So yeah, I mean, those decisions have to be fine tuned far more than maybe what they usually are as well. So just a comment on pricing. And yeah, like Ray mentioned, it's farm income is going to be a big problem with a lot of producers. So we're going to have to sharpen our pencils, so to speak, no question.
And now, Jake, as we wrap up, of course, Ontario growers are sitting on a bumper corn crop. So opposite problem, they're going to have to throw a whole bunch of groceries at the soil for next year, right?
Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, I think that was a bit of a leading question, but yeah, I think first of all, the crop's not in the bin yet, and so we'll see what the rest of this month brings. But I think it's that kind of long-term planning and knowing, hopefully, if you're hopefully you've got a recent soil test, and if you don't, after that corn crop going to beans, we don't typically think of beans as needing a lot of fertility, but there's good work in Ontario to show that, yeah, they benefit from, phosphorus especially, and of course potassium. So yeah, there's with prices the way they are as well. I mean, absolutely, it's very well worth your while getting those soil tests up to date. Knowing if you're low, yeah, there's an opportunity, I think, on a lot of acres to increase production as well.
Absolutely. All right. Mike Hilhorst with Federated Cooperative Limited and Jake Munroe with OMAFRA. Thank you so much to both of you for your time tonight, for being willing to answer everyone's questions. Thanks so much. And thanks to everyone in the comments who joined tonight's show. Great comments, everyone. Really fantastic to see so much engagement. And I think we have people from the States and Western Canada and Ontario. So really great to see. And of course, we'll be back next week. I'm hosting as well. As I mentioned, we're going to talk cover crops, red clover, a little more Ontario focused, but I promise there'll be something for the West as well. So Mike and Jake, thanks so much. And to everyone else, have a great night. Cheers, everybody.